Hello, everybody. A very good evening to all of you. Thank you for joining us today for the Jindal Global Law School Alumni webinar by distinguished alumnus Dr. Prajwal K. Aradhya on the topic of essentials of evidence and cross-examination. I am Professor Shireen Moti, Assistant Professor of Law and Director of Alumni Relations at OP Jindal Global University. OP Jindal Global University was started in the year 2009 under the visionary leadership of our Chancellor, Mr. Naveen Jindal, and our dearest Vice Chancellor, Professor Dr. C. Rajkumar. In a span of almost 10 years, OP Jindal Global University has been recognized as an institute of eminence, and Jindal Global Law School in particular has been ranked as the #1 law school in India by QS World Rankings. It is my great pleasure to invite our distinguished alumnus, Dr. Prajwal K. Aradhya, for this webinar today. Dr. Prajwal has had a very interesting professional journey, which is truly remarkable and by all standards, an outstanding journey. Dr. Prajwal completed his Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery from MR College in Karnataka. Soon after, he graduated from the 3-year LLB program at JGLS in the year 2017, where he was awarded a bronze medal for his outstanding academic achievements. He had been a brilliant student throughout, and we are so happy to have him with us today. After graduating from JGLS, Dr. Prajwal began his career in litigation as an associate at Crest Law Partners, Bangalore. Since January 2019, he has been working in the chambers of Mr. S. Kalyan Basavraj, former Assistant Solicitor General of India at the Karnataka High Court. His current work involves handling civil and criminal matters, including cases of medical negligence, which most of us would agree is best suited for him. Apart from his litigation work, he's working on a commentary on medical jurisprudence and toxicology, and places a lot of emphasis on updating his knowledge as well as creating knowledge for others. Dr. Aradhya is of the view that it is essential for law students and young lawyers to develop a comprehensive, practical understanding of the importance of evidence and the art of cross-examination. And this is something which is crucial to a practice in law. Today, we are lucky to have him with us, where he is going to speak to all of us about the practical aspects of litigation practice, in particular about essentials of evidence and cross-examination. With this, I welcome Dr. Prajwal to give his opening remarks. Welcome, Dr. Prajwal.
Hi, Shireen. Thank you. Thank you so much for the really good introduction you've given. So it's a pleasure to be a part of this webinar series. I hope I can do justice to this whole webinar series, and I hope I can share whatever I've learned during the course of my time as a litigator with whoever's present here.
Sure, and we are also looking forward to getting into the nitty-gritties of your lecture today. But before that, we would like to understand a few things about what made you choose law as a career, especially after you had completed your medical degree. And I'm sure you must be getting this as a first question and must be very thorough with the answer by now in terms of why law after medicine.
No, I mean, law was always my first and only career choice, to be honest, and I always wanted to be a lawyer right from childhood. But I mean, my ours was the first batch to give CLAT, and there were a lot of uncertainties about how exams were going and how things would be in the future. So, and I could not score well. With all honesty, I could not score well in CLAT, and I didn't get through any of the national law schools. And my parents were of the opinion that if I'm not getting into any of the national law schools, I shouldn't pursue law. So unfortunately, or fortunately, I got into medical college, and I was still not happy being a doctor. However noble one may call the profession. So soon after it, I was still pursuing my parents to let me do law. And a family friend of mine suggested that I should actually look into this university called OP Jindal Global University. And I visited the website, and I spoke to a couple of seniors who had graduated by then from Jindal, and so that is when I decided that if I'm going to do law, I think it is going to be from OP Jindal Global University. Gave my LSATs, and yeah, I finally got through to Jindal.
You seem very happy. You seem very happy with the decision of doing law from Jindal. But just for prospective students who are thinking of studying law, not only from Jindal but from anywhere, what are these two or three criteria that you would suggest them to look into while deciding which law school to go and study in?
See, the first biggest criteria I would suggest them to look into is the faculty. I mean, you yourself have been a part of Jindal, and we all know how amazing the faculty we are. You also are a part of that amazing faculty right now. Look into the faculty, look into the credentials of the faculty, because there's this huge desire. I wouldn't want to call it desire. There's this huge tendency to look into the placement outcomes of the universities to or the colleges to choose which college one would want to join into. But in my humble opinion, once you graduate and within 2-3 years of you getting into any kind of job you're getting into, where you're placed and where you're placed doesn't matter, and all that matters is what you've learned in your college and what kind of academic experience you have got, and that is what helps you in the long run. So the only criteria I would, and of course the kind of infrastructure the college is providing in terms of your library, in terms of your digital libraries and all those things, this is what I would suggest the one someone has to look into while getting into law school, and nothing else. It's not your not the name which the college has or anything else. It's the faculty and the academic infrastructure that one has to look into.
Okay, so more than the physical infrastructure, one should look at the academic infrastructure, which means
of course, yeah.
Meant for learning. Is that something which is good to flag for students who are deciding to pursue law? How was your experience at Jindal Global Law School, being a law student? Because all of the law students would always say, you know, it's a tough choice to make, and there are so many things to do in law school, and you are constantly flooded with assignments, submissions, deadlines. So, but what was a good part of law school for you?
So the good part of law schools, like I told, we had it's always good to have a very collective bunch of classmates who are very interested in academics, and you know the kind of discussions that take place. And I think the vice chancellor has reiterated this in all his meetings, that Jindal places a lot of importance in classroom discussions and not in anything else. So the kind of discussions we used to have, and I think each and everyone in the class used to have a great discussion, and we had this dialogue between faculty and the teachers, which made it very easy. And coming from someone who was a medical student, there was no scope for dialogue between you could not argue with your professors, you could not argue with your teachers. Here I was in this law school where I had the liberty to go and ask this professor what was wrong in what I did, and if whatever he's doing is wrong, and it was very well appreciated. That was one of the biggest things I would want to carry out of Jindal. Apart from that, yeah, they were all the time throughout the week. There used to be one or the other lecture series happening, one or the other talks that used to happen, and the kind of elective courses also that were offered were really great. The library, if one is really interested in learning something, or even if you want to just read up, the library, the Jindal library is one of the amazing libraries I've ever come across. The online material also is great. So yeah, it was all in all a very holistic experience coming out of Jindal for me. So one, I think most of my friends also would like to agree with me that they would like to remember for a very, very long time.
Yes, hopefully. We all miss our college days and hostel days, and what goes on in the hostel is a lot more fun than what goes on in the classrooms. But the idea is that at least in the classrooms, you can engage, discuss, debate, and come out with that idea of questioning everything that is happening around us. And we as lawyers love to question and love to argue. So,
Yes.
so how did you really decide to become a litigator? What was that moment of clarity, and or was it built? Did you build up to this decision over a period of time? Did you have this clarity while you were in law school? Because a lot of my students who are in fourth or fifth year, and many of them after graduating also take a couple of years to decide whether they want to go to a law firm, to litigation, get into NGOs, think tanks, academia. But what was it for you like? How did you discover that litigation is something that you would like to pursue?
I mean, see, there is no, but I mean, I want to whoever is listening to this lecture, I want to make it clear. It's okay to take time to get into what you want to get into. There's no hurry that you immediately after law school you need to get into the best thing that is suited for you. You can try venturing out. one of the best things the law students could do is to try out all different kinds of internship. Try interning with NGOs, try interning with organizations, with universities, try interning with litigating firms. So right in my example, what happened was right from my first internship, I got the first internship I got into was a litigating internship. So from there it began, and I kind of started developing some kind of interest with it. And my given my usual tendency to argue matters with professors and my friends all across, I kind of started liking it, and I could understand that I am very good at research, and I could actually question whatever is come put across to me. So this was one of the deciding factors. So one after the other, all the internships I was made available were all litigating internships. So the best advice is, I do your internships in all possible fields. Look, see what you like, see what you're good at, and try to combine this. And even after law school, there's no hurry to get into what you want immediately. I know a lot of people to this day who are still happy with whatever they're doing, and have shifted 2-3 jobs already, from litigation to corporate, from corporate to NGOs, and they're all happy. So at the end of the day, what matters is you being happy with whatever work you're doing, and it doesn't matter if you're doing it very soon after law school. Yeah.
Advice basically is that keep looking for that thing that you really want to do, and try and get that. Don't settle for one particular job or anything.
Yes, true.
Finding really motivates you. So what are you looking forward to most in your professional journey as a litigator? What is exciting in your work right now? What are you planning to do? And how does generally your day look like? What is the life of a litigator?
I mean, see, as a litigator, one thing is for sure, that there's something to learn each and every other day. Be it courtroom drama, be it the arguments which you can see of people arguing, or you learning and researching your own material or matter. There is no limitation to, as a litigating lawyer, to learn. I mean, it happens that each and every day you're sitting in a court waiting for your matter. Also, you could actually listen to someone else argue, or see what someone else cross-examine a witness, and there's so much to learn. Even to this day, that my seniors for this day have been so hungry for knowledge that they don't miss out on a single opportunity to attend any webinars or seminars or do online courses. And that is how I have been encouraged to do. So talking about how our daily life is, our mornings are exclusively dedicated to courts. We come back from courts depending on whether we have courts or not. The rest of the days we spend meeting clients and doing research over the matters we are working upon, drafting pleadings and preparing for arguments, preparing briefs to show it to your seniors to argue. It is a fun experience. There's a lot of running around in courts. You have to keep on moving, and you get to meet a lot of people, and you get to interact with a lot of people, and the kind of knowledge upon not just law, even things other than law, you get to learn. So it's quite a good experience to have.
Sounds like a day filled with a lot of work, challenging but yet exciting. So now I think, Prajwal, it's time to get into your presentation. So I would just share, I would request you to share your screen with everyone. I've given you the controls.
Yeah. I've shared my screen right now, Shireen.
Yes, it's visible.
Am I visible?
Yes, it is visible. No, the people, you have to open up the PowerPoint once.
Yeah.
Yes, now it's visible. You could make it a full screen, Prajwal.
Yeah.
Could you share the full screen?
I'm doing that.
Yes, it's visible. I would just request the attendees to kindly confirm that they are able to see the PowerPoint and hear us properly, so that we can then begin with the presentation. You can put your guesses in chat, or Onkar, could you confirm?
Yes, I'm also able to see it and hear it.
Okay, great. So Prajwal, of course, the topic for today is essentials of evidence and cross-examination. And through this, we would like to know what goes on in the stages of evidence gathering as well as cross-examination in courts. Beginning with a very, very basic and simple question, that what is the importance of this stage of evidence gathering in a trial? So over to you, Prajwal.
Yeah, Shireen, thank you. So let me start off, before answering your question, Shireen, let me start off with what exactly evidence means. I mean, Section 3 of the Indian Evidence Act talks about what an evidence is, and there are primarily two types of evidence. One is documentary evidence and the other is oral evidence. Oral evidence is any oral testimonies wherein the witness enters the box and makes a statement. And in documentary evidence, it's all the electronic records, printouts, all the other documentary evidence which could be which one could think of are the two documentary evidence. Now, what is the importance of evidence in a trial? So see, in any trial, be it civil or criminal, there are three important stages. The first is, in a civil case, it's a filing of pleadings where you finish filing your plaint and your written statement. And in a criminal trial is the framing of the charges and plea, where the accused pleads not guilty or guilty, depending on whatever the case is. After that comes a stage of evidence. Now, evidence is extremely important because in evidence, one is going to determine the question of facts and issues in the trial. How this goes in criminal cases, say for example, if someone is accused of murder under Section 302 of the IPC, evidence is led by the prosecution to show that yes, this person is guilty of murder and so he should be punished. And on the contrary, the defense leaves further evidence to show that the prosecution has not proved that the accused has committed any murder or anything of that sort. In civil cases, generally what happens is, depending on looking into the pleadings filed by both the parties, the court generally frames issues. And the issues are very specific, and the issues cast a burden of proof on the party who is alleging a particular fact. So this issue will have to be proved before the court in a civil suit for us to get a favorable decree, or for the suit to be dismissed, depending on whether you're plaintiff or the defendant. So yeah, it is extremely important in either cases, irrespective of whether it is a civil case or a criminal case. Evidence and cross-examination is one of the most crucial stages in a trial, and much of the outcome of your suit, of your case, depends on evidence and cross-examination. I myself have been witness to so many suits where even just after the stage of cross-examination, because our cross-examination has gone well, the other side has come forward to settle the matter, telling that we don't have any merits in the case, let's settle the matter and let's not drag the matter so long. So if a good cross-examination will give you really good results, and sometimes immediate results, like how we see in Shireen. So I think this is one of the most important things, and why evidence is very crucial in our trial, Shireen.
Okay, that is very interesting to know, to very well understand the importance of evidence when it comes to the beginning stages of trial, and how you have to sort of work in tandem with the investigating authorities as well, and how it could have a whole impact on the outcome of your trial finally. So it's very crucial in that sense. Having known the basics of what evidence is and in a trial and what importance it holds, my next question to you really is that what are the most important legal provisions which lawyers, young lawyers, students should be aware of when it comes to their matters in terms of evidence and cross-examination? If you could throw some light on that.
Yeah, see, as such, I want to make one thing clear. As such, there is no bar, or there is no particular thing to say that only these are the only provisions which you need to be thorough in order to be a successful cross-examiner, or in order to be a successful, in order to lead evidence successfully. But these statutory provisions which are there on the screen right now are the bare minimum one ought to know how to lead evidence, and what questions to be asked and what not questions to be asked, what kind of documents can be gone in evidence, and these are the things. Basically, Indian Evidence Act, Chapter 10 of the Indian Evidence Act, that is clearly, this is one of the last chapters which comes under the Indian Evidence Act, which talks about examination of witnesses. It talks about what a chief examination is, what cross-examination is, what's the leading question, when can a leading question be asked, and when can a leading question not be asked, and all those things. Chapter 10 of the Indian Evidence Act. And I'm going to repeat this again only for the purpose of this lecture. These are the statutory provisions one has to remember in mind. It will be better as much as possible to know the Evidence Act in and out in whichever trial you're conducting. And also Civil Procedure Code orders 14, 16, and 17. These are the very important. These are a few of the important provisions. Again, talks about what framing of issues, leading of examination of witnesses, production of witnesses, recalling of a witness, when a witness can be recalled, do the court has the power to recall a witness, when can evidence be led through a commissioner, and all those things. And similar procedure, provisions of the CRPC code is chapter 17 to chapter 17 to chapter 21 of the Code of Civil Procedure. Very similar to what is provided in CRPC, but with a few modifications when it comes to criminal law as to how evidence is recorded in a summary trial, how evidence is recorded in a summons trial and in a warrant trial, and all those things. So yeah, these are the bare minimum one need to know in order to be successful in evidence and cross-examination, if I may put it that way. Shireen?
Yes, thank you for that, Prajwal. So we have gone through the basics of statutory provisions which govern evidence and evidence stage of the trial. I just have a follow-up question on this, that when looking at these provisions and reading them together and applying it to the case at hand, how complex do you think is this process of evidence and cross-examination? Leaving aside the statutory provisions, how complex is it to navigate through this stage of the trial?
So it is. Well, see, initially, I'll give an example of my own. I'll give my own example in this matter. So initially, I used to find it very complex rather than very difficult. I used to find it rather very complex because, see, first of all, when you're drafting a suit, you will know you will exactly know what provisions will apply to this suit. But then, however, when it comes to evidence, it is a completely different ball game because you have what the other side has also said. So a lot of research will go into determining what has to go into the evidence of my case, what I'll have to do, and for that I will have to do a lot of research, and research will be with regard to both law and with regard to a lot of facts. So for the first few years, any lawyer would find it very cumbersome to understand exactly what evidence is, but as and when you get used to reading evidences, get used to doing cross-examinations more and more, it becomes easier. So I remember very well during my first cross-examination, I used to struggle a lot where I had made 100 different notes and I had to skip through each and every note, and it used to take a long time. But now I would like to say I'm fairly having a grip over cross-examination, and I can understand, and the kind of research you do also matters a lot. It is very, I wouldn't say it is very difficult to navigate. I'll say it will take time for you to understand how to navigate, if I may put it that way.
This seems like requiring a lot of organization and being very meticulous with your planning when it comes to cross-examination. So why don't you take us through the different stages of planning and what all goes into preparing for cross-examination?
Sure, yeah. Like just before talking about cross-examination, I just want to throw some light on examination in chief. What is examination in chief? Section 137 of the Evidence Act clearly says. It also defines what examination of a witness by the party who calls him shall be called examination in chief. It also talks what is cross-examination and what is re-examination. That I'll reserve it for the later part of this lecture. Why do we need examination in chief? To bring out before the court the real and the relevant facts. And it's basically, if I'm a plaintiff and I want to prove my case, I will be leading evidence that favors my case. And this is, in plain words, this is basically examination in chief. And it has to be given regarding the existence and the non-existence of a fact. If I am particularly saying that I am an owner of a particular piece of land, I have to show all the proof that is there in my behest to prove my case. As simple as it could get. And then, so how does the examination chief work in civil cases, and in how does it work in criminal cases are two different things. In a civil trial, examination in chief before 2002 was by means of question answer, where the counsel used to ask the witness questions and he used to answer it. But of late in the year 2002, there has been an amendment to Code of Civil Procedure, wherein there's a provision included where you can directly lead examination chief by means of an affidavit duly sworn to. You just hand over you swear to an affidavit and you get the affidavit marked, and whatever is there in the affidavit is considered as a testimony of the witness. But in criminal trial, it is different. So in criminal trial, what happens is, and more often than not, it's the public prosecutor who will be leading evidence on behalf of the prosecution. So he is going to ask questions. He is going to ask questions to the investigating officers, to the witnesses, to the eyewitnesses, to the punch witnesses. There are so many forms of witness, to the expert witness as well. And this witness, whoever it is, is going to give answers to those witness, and that's how the examination in chief takes place in a criminal trial. Now, moving on, there is very important, what we need to understand what the exact object and purpose of cross-examination is in order to understand why it is important to cross-examine a witness. See, cross-examination, in examination in chief, any party who is providing is deposing an examination in chief is going to depose facts which are going to help his case.
I have to interrupt you for a minute. Your voice is cracking a bit. Maybe it's from my end. So if you would try to speak a little slower, that would be helpful. Please
Sure,
continue.
sure, okay, sure. One of the most important objects of cross-examination is to find out the truth and to detect the falsehood in the testimony of a witness. So, like I already told, see, there is, if anyone who's leading examination in chief, who's swearing on oath and making a statement, oral test and an oral testimony, he will make statements which will favor his case. So, me as a cross-examining counsel, my aim is to actually find out the truth and to how to detect whatever and to show to the court that whatever this witness is saying is false. That is one of the most important objects of cross-examination. Now, sometimes I will have to there will arise instances where I will have to ensure that the court doesn't rely on the testimony given by a witness. This will come in very handy when I am actually cross-examining an expert witness. I have to show that, you know, whatever the opinion this particular expert has provided is not reliable, and this is not a credible expert whom the court should rely upon. So that's why his evidence should be thrown out. And this is one of the most important, another important object and purpose of cross-examination. Yeah, see, generally what happens is whenever we intend to cross-examine, there is a tendency to look into the larger picture and forget the minute details in both civil and criminal cases. It is very essential for us to even if a small minor admission by the witness is going to help your case, you have to cross-examine with regard to that also. One of the so a good example for this would be there is something called as a punch witness or the Mahajar witness in criminal trials, where, and this is a stock question which almost all criminal lawyers ask the punch witness as to where the Panchnama or the Mahajar was signed. So there is a good possibility that, you know, the police officers or the investigating officer, he will call the punch witness to the police station and make a statement of his own with regard to whatever is present at the scene of crime and take his signature. But the general rule is that, you know, punch witness or the Mahajar should be signed at the scene of crime, where the punch witness actually examines himself what exactly is present at the scene of crime and signs it. So the stock question which is asked is whether where he signed the Panchnama. If he admits to if he says that he signed it in the police station, even though it is very trivial, this is extremely crucial, especially in cases of circumstantial evidence where you break the chain of circumstances, and this is the first hit in the circumstantial chain where you can cause a dent in the prosecution's case, while including other dents, you can easily disprove the case of the prosecution. And there's some all said and done, we all know, even if a witness is speaking the truth, there's a lot of subjectivity involved in whatever he's saying. So our aim in cross-examination would be to reduce reduce or minimize the subjectivity as much as possible to ensure that the court understands what exactly is the real fact of the case, Shireen. So this is these are all the important objects and purposes of cross-examination. So with regard to your question as to how do one prepare for cross-examination, see, there's one very important thing.
Very interested in knowing that what goes on behind the scenes, because what we see in legal dramas and when we visit courts is something that is after all the hard work has been done in the offices. So this is what we exactly want to know, that how do you prepare, what is the timeline, what do you refer to, and I'm sure it must be an exciting journey to actually prepare for a cross-examination which might be upcoming in your cases.
Yeah, exciting at the same time very strenuous, if I may add. So see, one very important thing we all have to remember is be thorough with your facts. There have almost all lawyers, all senior lawyers whom I've come across and have spoken to, are talking about cross-examination, have told me that I should never begin a cross-examination until and unless I know my case thoroughly. From page 1 to the last page of my pleadings, of the charge sheet, I should know what all is there, what all is there in the charge sheet and what all have been stated by each and every other witness. One of the best ways I actually do while preparing for any trial is I make a chart, and I learned this from one of my seniors, one of my ex-bosses, where I used to make a chronology of events where I used to put the date, what the event that happened on that particular date, and the particular document referring to that particular event. So this will serve as a very good ready reckoner for me while I'm preparing for cross-examination. I generally sit through before cross-examination. We actually sit with the client on as much as possible for as long as possible. Take him through all the statements which have been made by other witnesses, which has been made in the affidavit. Ask him questions and think over it again and again, so you get a clear picture of what exactly happened and what exactly you need to elicit out of the witness. So yeah, until and unless you're not thorough with your cross-examination, do not step into the court. And this is not just for cross-examination. For any type of any appearances before the court, our seniors used to stress this upon very much, that one should always know what case you're appearing for, and without which you should never appear in a court, because eventually there is a possibility that the judge is going to ask you questions, and you should be ready to answer whatever the judge asks. Next thing is doing your research. Now, the research is extremely important. Now, the research will be with regard to law and as regards to facts as well. Now, why do we need research? As regards to law, because if you want a particular statement to be particular admission or a statement from a witness, you should well be aware what exactly is the law behind that particular statement which a witness is making. So I'll give you a very recent example of a case which we were trying. This was a partition suit where the question was whether money which was given as Stridhan and the property purchased with the Stridhan would also amount to Stridhan, and when this particular transaction took place, it was the year 1933. So we had to dig up more and more, and we eventually found out that there has been a 1933 law at that time here in Bangalore, which was called the Mysore Right to Women's Property Act 1933, and that provided what exactly is the definition of Stridhan at that point of time. So me knowing that definition of Stridhan, I could actually ask the witness what exactly Stridhan is and what exactly was the amount received and what did he do with the amount, and this helped me a lot while I was preparing for the cross-examination. As regards fact, yes, do your research as much as possible, because you will have to know each and every fact that will go into. If sometimes there is a tendency that your client will not tell you the detailed answer, you have with regard to the documents which have been produced before the court, with regard to the statement of an expert, You have a lot of books available right now, a lot of material which will be available online, and most of the documents which are produced before the court will be public documents, and they will be available on all government portals. Do your research properly, and then only enter the cross-examination court for cross-examination. You have to, one thing you have to remember is not to miss out on even the minutest details. So the general practice amongst lawyers, where what seniors tell all of us junior lawyers is to read your briefs 200,000 times. And probably a little exaggeration, but yeah, I actually would like to believe what my seniors used to say, that do not miss out on the minute details, because the more and more you read, the more and more information you get out of the briefs, and you'll be best prepared. So there was this a very small example where there was this witness whom we were supposed to cross-examine, and he had stated that he had met my client, and the meeting was recorded in the minutes of meeting. So we went through the minutes of meeting and all the documents again and again, and we found out that my client hadn't signed the minutes of meeting, and it was only the plaintiff who had signed the minutes of meeting. So this was very useful, because when we asked him questions during his cross-examination, when we asked him questions, if he knew if my client had signed the minutes of meeting, he told yes, and we could confront him with the document saying that there is no signature of my client, and this was and he agreed that there was no signature of the defendant, and so yeah, this was a very good admission in our favor in this case. So yeah, even the most minute details, it is essential to jot them down and make note of it. Sometimes these minute details are the ones which is going to help you win your case for your client. And next, and one more thing we have to remember is not to underestimate the witness you're cross-examining. Why? Because as much preparation we are going to do with our briefs and our cross-examination, this witness is going to be tutored by his counsel. He will be made aware of the kind of questions I might be asking and what kind of answers I should be giving. So I cannot barge into the court hall telling that, oh yeah, I have prepared very well, I'm a lawyer and this is a lay person, he doesn't know any law, so I'm going to ask him questions and he is going to answer, and this is going to be a win situation for me. No. Do not try to understand what kind of a witness you're cross-examining, especially if it is an expert witness. You should know in detail about the topic on which you're going to cross-examining. If you're examining a doctor, you should know what kind of opinion he has given, whether you have to consult your doctors, consult books. If you have any doctor friends, you can consult them, talk to your doctor. There are a bunch of books which are available online and in libraries. Go through them, do your research, and yeah, this is how you proceed further. Yeah, one very important thing, do not rely upon your memory while you're cross-examining, and you have to make a brief of each and everything. So there's this common joke which runs amongst litigating lawyers. Whenever someone says that I have gotten my I forgot the brief, it's at home, but I remember all the questions. This is a very the joke goes that, I don't want your head, I want your brief. You can keep your head at home and bring me the brief back. So yeah, because what happens is, even the person with the bestest of the memories, during the heat of cross-examination and during a line of cross-examination, you will tend to miss out on a few very important aspects. So it is better to have them written down. It is better to look, and there is no harm in looking into a briefs while you're cross-examining. We have to understand that while cross-examining, there is absolutely no necessity to be flamboyant and dramatic. All we have to do is to simply ask questions and elicit answers out of the witness. So yeah, and we have to be sure whether the statement of the witness we are cross-examining is a fact or opinion, and this is very important while we are examining an expert, because an expert relies upon the data provided to him and his experience to come out with an opinion, and court is not always bound by the opinion of an expert, as we all know about it. So, but a court will, if a fact is established, court is bound to consider that fact. So we have to try to differentiate what exactly a fact is and what exactly an opinion is. This will help us in cross-examining the expert witness a lot, Shireen. So this is, if I could put it this way, this is very few important things why you need to remember while you're preparing for cross-examination.
Very well put, Prajwal. And what you have really done is you have broken down the psychological sort of planning and meticulousness and organization that is required to get into a cross-examination. One cannot just think on their feet and be witty in court. That really doesn't work. You have to put in the hours and make notes of your notes so that you don't forget important points, because
Yes,
the time
yes.
of the court is limited and you have to convey a lot of meaning in that limited time.
True.
An additional question that I am interested to know is that what are some of the court mannerisms that you think are key to a successful cross-examination? It could be one or two, but since a large number of people who are attending today are students, this would be interesting for them to know that it's just not wit, but there are other things that goes on in court.
Yeah. See, there are a few basic principles one need to keep in mind and follow while cross-examination. First thing, look the witness in the eye. See, they say eye is the channel to one's mind, and this is extremely essential. So one of my ex-bosses, so if you remember how courts in India function, generally the lawyers have a tendency to stand next to the witness and cross-examine. But one of my bosses had this habit of standing right across the witness to look him into the eye and cross-examine, because you get to know what exactly the witness's state of mind is. You can easily sense if the witness is trying to avoid eye contact. There is a good possibility that the witness is lying, or he's flustered, or if he's intimidated by you. So depending on that, you can go ahead and mold your questions accordingly. Yeah, this is one of the very important things. And secondly, do not try to be intimidating. We should not create an impression to the witness that we are his enemy. So look, at the end of the day, the most important object of cross-examination is to elicit statements from the witness's mouth which is favorable to my client. And if I am trying to intimidate or badger the witness or scare him, the witness will often be very guarded, and even if even if he's a very simple witness, an easy witness, and he will give evasive answers, and he'll just say he doesn't remember anything, and this will be to the detriment. Generally what I try to practice to do is I address the witness during each and every question by his name. I'll be like, so Mr. So and so, where were you on so and so date? What did you do on so and so date, Mr. So and so? This kind of tries to create a personal connection with the witness. And one more very good way of trying to gain this personal connection is, if it's possible and as much as possible, with all our limitations, is to try and cross-examine the witness in the witness's language. So we all know that the trial courts have their own language, and I have examined a few witnesses here in Kannada. So it is easier for the witness to answer also, because he thinks that, oh yeah, this person is speaking my mother tongue, and it will be easier for the witness also to answer. So try to gain that personal bond with the witness so that it will be easier for you to ask him questions, and it will be easy. You can elicit answers out of him very easily, Shireen. Next,
Okay.
like I already told, one has to be very wary of the voice, tone, and tenor of the witness. Like I told already, if the tone and the tenor of the witness changes during cross-examination, a very smart or an intelligent lawyer will be easily able to pick it up, and he will be able to mold his line of questioning accordingly. Be very wary, because most of the witnesses, first of all, it is a hostile situation for any witness. You are sitting in a court, you're standing in a dock, there is a judge who's overlooking you, and there's someone who's trying to elicit answers which is not going to help you in your case. So yeah, it is going to be a very hostile environment for the witness. We have to be very wary of the tone and tenor of the witness. And this is very important for us to remember, that we should not lose our temper and not argue with the witness. Very simple, because if we start arguing with the witness, and if you're in a hurry, we will lose our own line of methodology, our own line of thinking. Our temper will be lost, our mood will be lost, and the kind of preparation we have done all the while to cross-examine will be lost. So as much as possible, we have to try and remain calm. If possible, sport a huge smile if it's possible. It will do wonders if you're smiling by cross-examining.
Okay.
Yeah. So short questions, plain words. Like I already told, there is no necessity in courts to be flamboyant or to use the eloquence of your English language or any other language in court. We have to ask short questions to the witness, which he can easily understand, plain words, simple questions. For example, did you woke up at what time? Did you wake? You woke up at 7 o'clock in the morning? Didn't you? Yes. You went to the supermarket at 11 a.m. Yes. You went to shop number 11 at the supermarket. Did you or did you not? Yes. These are the very simple questions. One has to keep the questions very short and very brief. And if you keep the questions very long, you will have to repeat the questions again and again. And in this whole repetition, your line of thinking also will be lost, and the witness gets more time to think about the question you're asking. Next, and yeah, this is very important, and this somewhere relates to my previous slides where I've talked about how important it is to do research. Never ever ask any question to which the answer to which you do not know.
I think this applies to everyone all the time, right?
All the time, not just you should know whatever question the answer for which you're asking it. If you're asking a particular witness what time he went to the supermarket, you should actually know what time he went to the supermarket. You should not be guessing what time he went, because you will already be expecting an answer. Even if the witness gives a different answer, your whole methodology will go for a toss. You will not know what this witness is saying, and you would have prepared for so long, and one simple question where you don't know the answer for might completely ruin the whole case. As much as possible, do not ask any question the answer to which you do not know. Next, yeah. So under the Indian Evidence Act, there is a very important thing to remember, that in chief examination, you're not supposed to ask leading questions. And also the Indian Evidence Act says that you may ask leading questions in cross examination, but all my seniors have always told that ask nothing but leading questions in cross examination.
Oh, that's news to me.
Yeah.
But that's what we read, that never ask leading questions. That's not allowed. Then how do you navigate through that in court?
See, as simple as possible. So basically what is a leading question? A question to which the answer is there in the question itself. And leading questions may be asked in cross-examination. And what is the most important object of cross-examination? To get an admission, to get a statement which is favorable to me and my case. So I am going to ask only leading questions. I am going to ask questions that the answers to which are going to favor my client. I'm not going to ask what. I'm just going to ask questions which the witness is going to answer with a simple yes or no. You went to the supermarket at 11. Yes or no? Yes. You went to shop number 11. Shop number 11 in the supermarket. Yes or no? While you were purchasing material from shop number 11, you heard a gunshot. Yes or no? The gunshot was coming from behind you. Yes or no? Stop it there. Because now gunshot was coming from behind. Say this witness was an eyewitness. If the gunshot was coming from behind, technically he's not an eyewitness, and his testimony is not reliable. So it is all my seniors have always told, try as much as possible, ask only leading questions in cross-examination. Yeah, and this is very important. So you need to know why exactly you're asking this question. What is the purpose and an object behind this question? So this is a very nice example. I was cross-examining this witness in a matrimonial case just before the lockdown. So this was a case for the divorce on the grounds of adultery, and this husband was the respondent, and we were for the wife, and we were cross-examining on behalf of the wife. So we found out, I started asking, this husband was in the habit of uh, meeting other women on I mean, dating apps, and he would meet them and he would go on dates with them and all those things. So my line of questioning started with if whether he knew about all these dating apps. And why knowing the object and purpose is important is because the husband's counsel opposed to this line of questioning, and I had to explain it to the judge why I am actually asking these questions. Because if the husband knows about dating apps, and if the husband has used the dating apps, we had material readily available with us which showed that husband was using this dating app, and he had paid all those membership for those dating apps on Google Play. We had done our research. So you should know what exactly is the purpose and the object of your cross-examination. After I explained to the judge why I'm asking these questions, the judge allowed the question to be asked, and we got a few favorable admissions from the client. Yeah, yeah, and this is
these are the kinds of questions that are asked in courts during cross-examination, and I'm sure family law matters are much more difficult to handle as opposed to other kinds of civil and criminal matters.
Yeah,
because
actually, in fact, if I may put it this way, most of your testimony, most of your material to argue in your in matrimonial cases is based out of oral testimonies only, because it is in matrimonial cases it's a classic case of he said she said. So court entirely depends on testimonies more often than not. So these are the questions you should be prepared while answering cross-examining in matrimonial cases. Yeah, I'm sorry. One thing you have to keep in mind. So in civil cases, especially in family disputes between members of the same family, even in matrimonial cases for that matter, there's a lot of animosity between the parties. One party would want to try and pull the other party to the and he would want to show him in a bad picture or something, and he would want you to ask this particular question to the witness. Do not do that. You have to remember that you have been engaged by your client to help him win your case, and that is what you're supposed to do. You do not ask any questions to please your client. You have to explain it to him, telling that, listen, my job is to win the case for you, and you better let me do it, and I'm not going to ask any questions to please you. As simple as that. Now, so what happens is when you ask a question and you get a favorable admission, do not make the witness repeat the answer, because the judge would have already heard the question and he would have already dictated it and made note of it. It would have already gone on the deposition. Now, if you ask the witness another the question again, the witness already knows the answer to it, and there's a good chance that he might modify his answer. So this will actually be to your detriment. So what you have to do is, you get a favorable admission, the judge make notes of it, quickly move on to the next question. Don't let the witness ponder over the question again. Yeah, this is one of the very important things to do. This is how you try and trick the witness to make admissions in your favor. You start your line of questioning from a very seemingly distant fact which does not have any relevance to the case in hand, and slowly you bring on this witness through a series of questions to an answer that you want. So I'll give you an example of this partition suit which was filed by the children against the father, and we were actually for one of the third-party purchases. So this was basically a collusive suit where which was filed to defeat the interests of the third-party purchasers. That's my client. So while I was cross-examining the father, I started asking. They had stated that father and children have developed animosity. They're not talking to each other now, and they're living in two different parts of the city, very far away from each other, and all those things. So I started asking questions. If the father was very close to the daughter, and how close he was. Did he drop her to school very often? What classes children are studying, and all those things. After a series of questions, say about 5 to 10 questions, they asked him, when was the last time you met your daughter? And the father immediately told that he met his daughter this morning when he dropped her off to the school. So right now, this was sufficient for me to show that there's no animosity, because the father already dropped the fact that father dropped her to the school in the morning shows that the father and the daughter are in good terms, and this suit is merely a collusive suit filed to defeat the purpose of the third party, that is my client. This is a very difficult task to learn, because you will only learn this in the course of time, and my only advice is not to get disheartened if you're not able to succeed in this in this kind of questioning.
Okay.
Yeah, do not cross-examine any more than what is necessary. Like in my previous example, the father told that he dropped off he met his daughter today morning when he dropped her off to the school. I ended it there. I did not cross-examine anymore because I got what I wanted from the witness. I stopped it there, because the more unnecessary cross-examination you do, the more tendency of the witness to move away from the original facts of the matter. Last
Thank
few
you.
points.
Okay, sorry, you were speaking. Is there something that you were adding to that point that you were making?
No, nothing.
So thank you, Prajwal. Actually, the key takeaways that I see from how to plan and how to go about cross-examination that you just spoke about is, of course, you pointed to a number of skills that are so key to a career in law, which is research, discipline of organization and being meticulous, being punctual in court, maintaining your calm and composure, because it can be the most chaotic places sometimes. Courts can be more chaotic than other workplaces, and also the fact that you have to go prepared. I mean, there is no substitute to preparation, and adjusting the questions according to how you are communicating with your witness. Also, the fact that it's so I found it very interesting when you talked about matrimonial disputes, because you're really getting into the lives of people and understanding their stories, and sometimes it can be something that affects you more than other matters, because you're dealing with real people, real situations, and situations which are very personal to them.
Relationships, yeah.
That was amazing, and that was lovely to know about evidence and cross-examination from you. Thank you. That was like a short course on evidence and cross-examination. We have so many questions for you, and I'm just looking through them, and I'm going to ask you in a minute or two. But before that, I have a question for you. Since a lot of our students, a lot of Jindal students are attending this webinar, what is the, and other students from other law schools as well, and we appreciate that. What are some of the reference material or books that they should rely on or read for evidence, cross-examination, CRPC, criminal law? Some books that you would like to suggest, which you have discovered in your own research.
There is a very old book which I actually found in one of the online. I don't know if it's called the Prem's Cross-Examination. This is a book which was published in the year 1940. If you could, I can actually share the link of the book on the chat at the end of this. So it contains comprehensive information about what to do in a cross-examination and what not to do in a cross-examination. As regards other books of evidence, there's a very good commentary on evidence by Sarkar.
Sarkar, okay.
Yeah, so Sarkar's evidence and commentary on evidence is one of the most sought after commentaries. And if you're actually looking into any CRPC, Sarkar is also good, and CPC's Mullah on CPC is a really good read. Yeah, and there's this foreign author, James Wellness, his book on cross-examination, and all these books are available online. So these are the very few material I could think of while you're preparing for evidence and cross-examination.
Thank you for sharing that. And now I'm going to start posing questions. We've got a number of questions, and the first set of questions is from a fellow alumna, Ms. Yashaswani Mittal. And she has two sets of questions for you. She is currently working with the UN and has been a champion for human rights and health law, and she's another of our distinguished alumna. Her first question is to do with forensic evidence, wherein she's asking you to answer that when collecting forensic evidence, especially for sexual and gender-based violence cases, what are some of the key issues that investigators or police should keep in mind? This is the first question. I'll give you the second question also, and you could answer collectively. It's to do with the present times and the challenges that we're facing in the legal profession because of COVID-19 pandemic. What do you consider are some of the key issues for prison and police authorities to consider, keeping in mind the overcrowding of jails and also judicial pendency in India? I think both of them deserve some importance and
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, so see, with regard to evidence and investigation in sexual violence cases, and I will have to bring in a lot of my medical college experience into this. So there's a tendency for all examiners, for all investigating officers to overlook the fact, not overlook, I'm sorry, to actually stress upon the fact, say for example in a rape case, there is a very huge tendency, and this can be this is actually reflected in many of our judgments and also in many of the commentaries which I have come across on medical jurisprudence, is the over assertion on whether or not a woman is sexually active or not. My only advice is, your woman's sexual activity does not have anything to do with the rape. So one has to we have to try and inculcate a practice where a woman is not asked her sexual activity when she comes and complains of rape, or when she's being investigated of rape. So the doctors, the gynecologist, so immediately soon after it, there's this test called as a two-finger test, which determines whether the woman has been sexually active or not. I would say it is irrelevant in these scenarios. At the end of the day, while you're investigating a case of sexual harassment or rape or gender violence for that matter, all that matters is the only question the prosecution needs to answer is that there was no consent and there has been sexual intercourse without consent and against her will, and that is enough. That is the only material one needs to establish. Apart from that, one has to be wary about one's, how do I put it? Yeah, if you're investigating cases of gender violence and sexual discrimination and sexual harassment, there is a lot of tendency to look into the intention of the prosecutrix also, especially in cases of sexual harassment and her conduct in cases of sexual harassment. The cops especially have this tendency to ask more and more questions, asking what were you doing out there at that point of time, why were you with him at that relevant point of time when this happened. Again, all these things for the matter of investigation is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, the woman was anyone who has been harassed, not just the woman, anyone who's been sexually harassed or any of the sexual or raped, that has never asked for it. We have to I would like to again stress upon this again, that we have to inculcate and we have to give rise to a practice where all these questions are not asked to a woman, and a woman has to just show proof sufficient to show that she has been harassed or that she has been raped. I don't know if that
add to that the question. I'm redirecting the question a bit. What about the insensitivity of the judiciary as well as the police officials and investigating officer when it comes to cases of gender-based violence? I think that's what Yashaswini is trying to point towards as well.
That is very true.
What is the role of an investigator or a police officer when it comes to cases which are as sensitive as gender-based violence, be it in any form, and what can we possibly do to avoid adding insult to injury? As you said, the two-finger test is something which is often been regarded as being very intrusive and adding insult to injury. So what is it that investigators and should keep in mind in these cases? That is something, 1 or 2 points on that would be great.
Yeah, see, I mean, I totally agree with you when you say that there is a system of bias that has been created already with regard to not just the investigating officers, even lawyers for that matter, and the judiciary also, the trial court and the high court judges. they keep on asking these questions again and again. What was the woman doing at that place? So one of the effective ways to actually eradicate this bias, I mean, so this bias, if I may add, will actually have a huge impact on the investigation of the case as well. So I mean, so one of the effective ways, in my opinion, to reduce the bias would be to actually inculcate this practice in during the training of the investigating officer itself. We need to train, we need to educate the investigating officers, telling them, listen, this is not how you actually, this is not your course of investigation. And apart from that, there is nothing much a lawyer could do during an investigation, except during the cross examination or during the examination in chief. We have to point out to the kind of discrepancies that have come across in the mode of investigation, where where you have to show that the investigating officer ought not to have investigated in this manner, ought not to have taken the testimony in this way or that. Yeah, but everything completely depends on creating a sensitivity amongst the investigating officer, educating them regarding gender sensitivities while investigating.
Okay, that's great. And the second part of the question that Yashaswini reiterated for you.
Could you please repeat it? Yeah.
19 things about overcrowding and as well as judicial pendency. How can we deal with these things?
I'm sorry, Shirin, I'm not able to hear you.
Okay, so the second question that Yashaswini had was about the current situation wherein there is an overcrowding of jails as well as a pendency of judicial matters. So how do we in the legal ecosystem deal with these challenges?
See, pendency, I mean, somewhere I would I would be I wouldn't mind being telling that we all lawyers are guilty of actually of the fact that there are so many pending cases in our courts to this day. I mean, we tend to take adjournments as much as possible, and I know most of my lawyer friends are going to hate me for this, but yeah, at somewhere I personally would like to believe that we are also guilty of it. See, one of the better ways, I mean, we need more courts. We need more and more courts. As a matter of fact, let me tell you, there are about 82 courts in the city of Bangalore itself. 82 court halls in the district, the 82 district and session court halls in Bangalore itself, and each and every of the court halls are overcrowded, overfilled, overburdened. So one of the best methods, one of the important methods rather than the best methods, to actually expand the courts, increase the number of courts, you decentralize the courts, you increase the jurisdictional courts which are available, and equip the courts with well-trained judges. We need really well-trained judges. We need judges who can actually understand whatever they are reading, whatever they are writing. This is one of the most important methods to minimize the pendency of the judiciary. And of course, we have to understand, the judges have to start penalizing advocates for filing frivolous suits. And yeah, more often than not, it happens that just to harass the other side, just to harass my neighbor, I go and file a suit. And somewhere, like I told, somewhere the lawyers also have a part to play. If you have read Mr. Fali Nariman's biography, he clearly says that, when you don't have a case, you have to try and persuade your client not to file a suit.
Okay.
Lawyers often don't do that because the more briefs and more cases, the more money you make. Yeah, try
Too honest for this webinar, but that is something that we have been told since law school, that's what happens. Everyone is contributing to the delay, and everyone is speaking about the delay. Another interesting question that has come up from one of our attendees, Jasmine Madan, is that what do you do if the written testimony and the oral testimony is different in terms of the witness decides to add something that has not been already submitted as a written testimony? How do you deal with such situations then?
See, this generally happens in criminal trials. So what happens is the witness is making a statement which is something to what he stated in the charge sheet. So at this time, such a witness is generally called as a hostile witness. So hostile witness, and generally the practice is one should never cross-examine his own witness. But then but then in case a witness turns hostile, the counsel who's brought that witness upon may cross-examine him to show that whatever he's stating before the court is not true, and whatever he's stating whatever he has stated in the charge sheet is true. So yeah, this is one of the methods to deal with contradictory statements in your evidence and in your statements.
A lot of these questions that we're receiving are about that exact performance of conducting the cross examination, because I call it a performance because it seems like you are rehearsing, and then that final day comes where you are performing in front of the court and all the people who are present at court on that day. So one of the related questions to the previous question is by Vignesh Ramanathan. The question that when a witness changed the statements he answered once after sufficient time has passed in the trial, and a related question which is being asked of is that what do you do about these challenges that the witnesses pose in terms of changing their statements, speaking dishonestly? How do you deal with all of these situations? So this is a question by Numair as well as Vignesh. That if a witness,
the first question, Shireen?
First question is that if a witness has given a particular testimony in court and later on decides to change his or her statement, then how do you deal with that situation? And the second question is that how do you really know about differentiate between the truth and the untruth, and how do you deal with it in court if a witness is lying, maybe?
The only way to differentiate between the truth and the untruth is, like I already told, do your research, prepare yourself, know whatever is there in your case, talk to your client. That is the only way. Sometimes there is a good possibility that your client is also lying, but then we have to remember somewhere that you are fighting for your client, and you have to try and believe your client as much as possible. And as regards when a witness is changing the statement he's made, if I may actually, there is a provision for re-examination under the Indian Evidence Act. So let me finish. Let me take you guys through re-examination. So Section 137 of the Indian Evidence Act also provides for re-examination. Say whatever he stated, if there's a discrepancy in the cross-examination that occurs, so the person who's calling upon calling upon the witness to cross-examine to be examined may re-examine the witness. He might ask you. I can ask my own witness questions stating that why did you when you were cross-examined, why did you give such a statement? This is basically, and again, this is the discretion of the court. This is basically to clear any ambiguities or discrepancies which were present. I cannot introduce new facts into this. So if the witness in chief examination says that I saw him go and stab the accused, and in his cross examination he says that I didn't literally see him, but I heard him shout. There is a discrepancy which occurs. So I can re-examine my witness, asking them that why did you make such a statement? What was the reason for you for making such a statement? And can you explain what was the reason in you giving such contradictory statements in your examination in chief and cross examination, just to clear out the ambiguity or any discrepancy? Of course, again, this is subject to the discretion of the court, only where the court feels that there is an ambiguity or a discrepancy can the court allow you to do re-examination and let the witness explain himself.
That's interesting to know. A related question here is by Abhishek Pandey. What he is trying to ask really is that so witnesses are generally, of course, nervous when they're on the spot and everyone is looking at them, and there's one lawyer asking that witness question after question. But how do you spot the weaknesses in a witness's testimony, and when do you know it's time to attack or to ask that question so that you get the desirable answer? I mean, I'm sure it's a matter of situation and you need situational awareness, but is there an example wherein you've caught the witness saying something and you asked a particular question and you got a favorable answer?
Yeah. So yeah, there is. So there was this witness. My senior was cross-examining. This was a suit for possession, and we had taken the defense plea of adverse possession. So the one of the statement which the witness, we were examining the witness, and the witness gave a statement that they have been in joint possession with my client for the past several years, and they have been cultivating. It was an agricultural property, and that they had been cultivating over the land for the past several years jointly with our client. So what have we started cross-examining, and this was one of the weakest points in his testimony, because if even he knew that he was lying. So we started cross-examining and asked him if he stated that he was in joint possession with the defendant, yes, and if he was cultivating over the scheduled property, and he admitted to be yes. The next question we asked was, what are you cultivating over the scheduled property? Because he did not know what was cultivating, because our clients were the one in possession, and practically they were not cultivating anything. It was just a barren land. Witness went ahead to state that we are cultivating ragi on the shoot scheduled property. So this was when we really found out that the witness is lying, and we went on to ask further questions to state that are you cultivating on all of the scheduled property, or only on a part of it? He told only on a part of it we are cultivating. On which part are you cultivating, we asked, and he told we are cultivating towards the east of the property. And when this kind of went on, and where because on the eastern side of the property there was a farmhouse which was constructed. There was no vacant land on the eastern side of the property. So for you to know that that the witness is lying, you need to be having a mastery of facts. And the moment you know that this person is lying, from there on you can actually grab onto him, like pounce upon him, like whatever you can do, whatever to just destroy his credibility. That's all.
Okay, that's a lovely answer. We have time for one or two more questions. I'll try and pose them to you. So there's a very interesting question that has come from Shrey Agarwal. The question really is a combined reading of section 313 of the CRPC and article 20 subclause 3 of the Constitution. So what Shrey is saying is that he finds a contradiction between section 313 of the CRPC and article 20 subclause 3 of the Constitution, because if you look at 313, subclause 1 subclause B, it says that the court it mandates the court to ask the accused to explain the circumstances in light of the evidence produced by the prosecution. However, at the same time, the accused is neither given an oath nor he is required to answer such questions. That the accused has a right to remain silent, but the phrase under section 313 subclause 4 says answers given by the accused have been used synonymously by the courts. If silence of the accused is being inferred as an answer under section 313 subclause 4, then does it violate article 20 subclause 3? So can silence be an answer? That is the crux of this question. Can silence be considered as an answer? And whether that is then contradictory to article 20 subclause 3?
No, I mean this generally is. I would not say it is contradictory. I would not say it is contradictory to or violative of 20 subclause 1, because if you read section 313, it basically says that 313 is generally a 313 statement is taken after the witness is being cross-examined. After the prosecution leads their witness, all the witnesses are examined and cross-examination is finished, is when the 313 statement is taken. So what the court does is, see, now the court places all the material facts before the witness. The court says, see, this is what the investigating officer told, and this is what he has deposed. This is what the expert opinion told. This is what the eyewitness has told. Now, considering all these facts, what do you want to give any statement upon this? It is not plainly just based on the material available. The court is not going to ask any questions after only reading evidence, and once evidence is complete, the trial is in motion, and evidence is already a part of the record. So there is nothing the accused can do to do away with that particular material of evidence which is there before him. So yeah, this per se, this generally doesn't violate any provisions of the Constitution, because the court here is giving an opportunity to the accused to explain why the court should still consider him as not guilty, and or why why this particular witness is giving particular answers. Yeah, and this is generally this section 313 happens at the end of prosecution witnesses, Shireen.
Okay, that's lovely to hear. Last question, and then we will sort of, because we don't have much time, we have more questions that I've tried to accommodate as much as I can, given the paucity of time. So the last question from the attendees is that if you could give us a brief overview of the timeline that is involved in the evidence and cross-examination stages of the trial, and how much time and resources are really spent on investigation. Of course, you have the IO and you have other stakeholders in this process of collecting the evidence as well as undergoing investigation. And I know every case is different, and you can't give a timeline in that sense. But approximately, how long does it take for all of this to happen?
I mean, like you rightly put it, there is no particular timeline for how long a trial is going to end, irrespective of whether it is a civil or a criminal case. So generally, like I already told, there are 3 stages in both civil cases or criminal cases. So in criminal cases, it starts off with either a complaint or an FIR being lodged, and investigating, and if it is a cognizable, depending on whether it is cognizable or non-cognizable offense, arrest takes place and there is bail which happens. And after that, there is investigation which goes on. So the CRPC categorically provides for a timeline within which one has to file a charge sheet before the court, irrespective whether the bail has been obtained or not. For any warrants cases, there's a timeline of within 60 days, the prosecution is supposed to file charge sheet, and in any sessions matter, I'm sorry, for any matters triable by the magistrate, it is 60 days, and for any matters triable by the sessions court, it is within 90 days one has to file the charge sheet, failing which the accused will be discharged. Again, there are a lot of cases, judgments which actually deal with all these things. There's the Pankaj Kumar case, Pankaj Kaur case, which recently dealt about what happens if charge sheet is not filed within the stipulated period of time. And once charge sheet is filed, again subject to the availability of court and the cooperation of the accused counsel, the availability of witnesses to be present before the court, the time availability before the court, trials go on. After framing of the charges, there is plea, where the accused will be read out the charges which are levied, which are made against him, and he'll be asked to state if he is guilty or not guilty. And depending on whether he pleads guilty or not guilty, the trial continues. And soon after that is your examination, and then there is the 313 statement, and then there is the defense examination, defense evidence, and finally leading to arguments and summing up your arguments and closing up. And in civil trials, it's also much similar, like this finalization of pleadings, statement, framing of issues by the trial court, evidence, plaintiff evidence and cross-examination, defendant's evidence and cross-examination, arguments and judgment. Yeah.
Thank you, Prajwal. Now, final set of questions for the benefit of attendees who are mainly students and young lawyers. I have these 3 questions for you. The first question that I have for you is, why should one choose to study law? Some of them, the attendees are high school students as well, and that would be something which would be great to know from you being on the other side. The second question that I have for you is, what are the career opportunities available for law graduates these days? And the final question is, how does one prepare for a career in litigation?
I mean, why law? We can go on answering that question for days together if you ask me that question. But as simple as it is, law is something where there is scope for each and everything. And lawyers, they say, are jack of all trades. If you have to work on a particular matter, there is no limit to the knowledge, the kind of knowledge you're going to earn by studying and practicing law, if I can put it as simple as that. And it is a very bright career as well. Admittedly, lawyers are one of the few flamboyant professions which we could see in the world, not just in India. And there is a scope for us to be involved in policy making, in law making, to be a part of the judiciary, to try and bring out changes in the society. If you would ask, if I had to sum it up in a sentence or two, yeah, this is why you need to study law. And what was the next, second question, Shireen? I'm sorry.
The question was about career opportunities for young law graduates, and the last question was, how does one prepare for a career in litigation?
The career opportunities, like I told, it is vast. You can join as a litigating associate in any of the law firms or under a lawyer. You can be a judicial clerk under any of the judges of the Supreme Court or the High Court. You can join as in-house counsels for any of these companies. You can be a corporate lawyer. You can get into academia. You're one of the biggest examples, Shireen. So you can be a very successful academician also. You can get into policy making. There's a lot of policy making bodies. There are a lot of NGOs which are working in policies. Like I already told, just do your thorough research, look into your internships, and then you can decide upon what kind of career you want to get into. And as to preparing for litigation, the only advice I would like to give for anyone preparing for litigation is to try and read as much as possible. See, and I'm not stating only read stuff related to law. Try to be as innovative as possible. Try to be wary of the current affairs that is happening around your surroundings. Be aware of the politics in your country. Be aware of the politics in global politics as well. Stay up to date with latest judgments. You have access to so many online journals, online websites. Keep yourself updated about the latest judgments that are coming up. Read as much as possible. Read. This is the only way we could actually be a successful litigator.
Okay.
That's my one bit of what to do for a career in litigation.
So thank you so much for that, and that has been very, very helpful to understand what all goes into the practice of law and how does one prepare themselves for it, and how challenging and exciting it can be at the same time. And it was lovely hearing you speak about your experiences, because those are lived experiences, and when you listen to them, it really gives you a picture of what it looks like on the ground. Most importantly, when we are in law school, we have a very different idea of what law is and what the practice of law is. But once we step out, we see a whole new different side of law, and that's where we actually start engaging with people, engaging with the law, and then sort of becoming a practicing lawyer. So it was great to have you, Prajwal, here today, and thank you to all the attendees. We are, as OP Jindal Global University, your alma mater, we are proud of what you are doing and what you are taking the Jindal name forward, and also encouraging your juniors to take up litigation as well as mentor them, which is truly remarkable. And we wish you all the best for your professional career, and keep coming back and holding these webinars for educating the larger audience. Thank you to you, and thank you to all the attendees. Have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiri. Thank you.